1. The content shared in this podcast is strictly for informational purposes and should not be construed as financial or legal advice. 2. The opinions expressed by the hosts and guests are solely their own and do not represent the views of their employers or affiliated organizations. 3. None of the projects or companies discussed should be considered as endorsements or recommendations. 4. While efforts are made to ensure accuracy, the information provided may not always be up to date or entirely reliable. It is advisable to conduct independent research and seek professional guidance before making any financial or legal decisions. 5. The hosts and guests of this podcast shall not be held liable for any consequences or actions resulting from the use of the information provided. 6. All content, including text, graphics, and audio, is protected by copyright laws. Unauthorized reproduction or distribution is strictly prohibited. 7. Any discussions on sensitive topics aim to foster inclusivity and respectful dialogue, but differing opinions should be expected and not attributed to the podcast creators or sponsors. 8. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge and agree to these disclaimers, and you are responsible for your own interpretation and application of the information presented.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 8 of the Intersection4 Podcast. You have your usual 3 hosts here. You have Brendan, you have James, and you have me. We have an investor, we have a founder, and we have a technologist, a product guy, or however you want to describe me. I think it's kind of an ongoing gag that I don't know how to describe myself. But we also have a guest today. We have a special guest. We have Arian. Arian runs a early stage, middle stage kind of holistic fund based out of Vegas, focusing lately on consumer products and consumer tech. So we're excited to chat a little bit more about just consumer products and the consumer markets. But before we even go any further, I'll just pass it on to you, Arian. I'm sure you're a lot better at introducing yourself than I am. So just want to give us a quick overview and how do you get connected to the pod, right? I know you know James, but it would be interesting to share a little bit more about how you guys know each other and also some of the work that you do as well. And we can take the conversation from there.
Yeah, sure. So, glad to be here today. So James and I originally met at SMU. We were in the same accelerator program. He was building his firm and I was working on an ed tech startup. And we were kind of the only two in there. The program was still very new. And so I was building that. He was killing it with his firm. And then I continued building it. COVID happened, tried a few pivots, ultimately decided that selling the software to a small group was the best way to go forward. So sold the software, spent some time in investment banking, and through that I met the GP of Dream Ventures, Richard Blankenship, and he had been sort of leading early stage investing out of a family office based in Vegas. The family office owned and operated a few media assets. Originally had one of the largest student lending businesses in the early 2000s. And so they did 2 things. They invested in venture directly, and then they operated their portfolio companies. So they sold 2 of them this year. The current company is a company called Poker Go. So if you're into poker, they produce, probably 2/3 of the world's poker content. They've got a beautiful studio in Las Vegas, the Aria Hotel. And so Richard had kind of been leading their early stage investing arm, and he came to me and he was like, I'm raising a fund. And I looked at him and I was like, I think you're crazy in this environment. This was about a year ago. And so, within a couple of months, he had 2x'd our fund target. And then, I decided it was probably amazing opportunity to join. I myself and my family were LPs in the fund. Pretty small team. We all work for the family office, but we spend 99% of our time on the fund. And so been chatting with Brendan and learning a lot from James on, how to invest, what things to look for. And that's how I'm here.
Yeah, sounds great. We're glad to have you, Arian. A lot to learn from you when it comes to consumer tech and consumer, but also we've been having discussions about how the firm is looking beyond consumer tech as well now. So my world of investing is very different than yours. The most like consumer tech and consumer CPG specifically I've seen is through Shark Tank and some of those deals, right? And I think a lot of people, that's where they see most of the consumer deals happening, or at least where they are exposed to consumer investing. So I'd love to, from your perspective, how you learn from you, how you see tech investing being different than consumer investing, and what are the, things you look for in a business that tech investor might not, and what are the same things that you look for in a business that a tech investor does as well?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll break this into 2 kind of answers. One is how we landed on consumer and CPG. It's a tough place to be as an investor. And so what happened is the family office group had made some great investments in some, now famous consumer companies. And through that, we got access to deal flow that we consider better than other sectors where we could potentially invest in. And so when we first started the fund, a question came up is a lot of pre-seed and seed investing is based on the founder. We're not necessarily thesis driven being a generalist fund. So we kind of lean on our founders to guide us into the right direction. And so we noticed that our deal flow tended to be a lot better in the CPG and consumer space. And so that's kind of how we landed on that space. Now, CPG versus tech investing, there's a lot of things that are very similar, but there's also so many that are very different. I think the first thing that's probably very apparent is the ceiling isn't nearly as high enough. So most of your CPG investing, so actual physical products, you can hope that one day they become unicorns, but the truth is they kind of you end up between 100 million to a 300 million, and that's a fantastic outcome. And so that's a big factor. It's a lot more singles and doubles than home runs, which is challenging because at a venture fund, you're kind of in the business of home runs. So that's been an interesting angle as well. And then I think the third biggest difference is you have to be very, very sensitive on valuation. And I know a lot of tech investors may be, but we were talking with another investor, I won't name them. They had missed ramp at 25 million. They didn't want to, they thought it was, closer to 15 or 20. And so, obviously ramp is a huge success now. And in CPG, it's a bit different because again, if your ceiling's around 200 million at enterprise value, you kind of, at an early stage, you want to get in sub 10, sub 15 and try to get as much ownership as possible.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I actually have a quick follow-up here that I wanted to ask based on what you mentioned, Hamis. I think most people's perception of CPG is Shark Tank, or CPG investment is Shark Tank indeed. And I think that changes the way that the general public is thinking about entrepreneurs broadly. So when you tell somebody, "Oh, I have a company," they're like, "Oh, they associate that with Shark Tank, they associate that with that model." But as an investor, I'm curious if you've seen how that model, because like what you see in Shark Tank is not real investment, right? Like you don't really invest in a company by doing like live, like kind of, you don't invest in a company the same way that you negotiate discounts when you're buying a pound of bananas in the market, right? That's not the same way that's not the way that it works. So my question is, do you think that model and how widespread that became has impacted founders in the CPG market? Because even as a consumer myself, when I'm say scrolling through social media, I see that a really big strategy of a lot of the CPG companies are to advertise based on their Shark Tank pitch. So they basically have their Shark Tank pitch and they basically say, "Hey, this is my product, buy for me because we were on Shark Tank." How do you think this is impacting founders directly from the investor perspective?
Yeah. Is that for me or Aryan?
For Aryan.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to chime in, by all means, but this is mainly for Aryan.
Of course.
Yeah, you see it a lot. We've seen a lot of brands that we've looked at, and they go on Shark Tank and they close or may not close a deal, but Shark Tank's a place where they can get a lot of viewership. So there's been a lot of successful brands that go on there and they have no intention to close a deal, right? Because a lot of the deals you get some of the time are like you lose a third of your company, a fourth of your company. They're very aggressive deals, and I think adding on to what you said, what is more interesting is the amount of celebrity brands there are. So I think the first wave of CPG was your better for you products, right? So you've got your legacy products, and now the first wave is here's something that's healthier, right? Then the second wave was all the celebrities that came out with their individual alcohol brands. It's endless. The list is endless. So if you actually look at the number of new CPG companies from like 10 years ago to today, it's like 20x the size. Like everyone has a CPG brand nowadays. And it's really hard because a lot of these founders, what ends up happening is, they see celebrities and Shark Tank and a lot of these other platforms as a form of distribution. And then it kind of ends up only being a one trick pony. So you see a lot of like, here's this company, they did 2 million in revenue, enter A-list celebrity who's a co-founder, but they're not actively actually working on the business. And so we see a lot of disconnected teams. Like I feel like I look at our tech deal flow. So 30% of our portfolio is sort of in CPG, another 30% in consumer, so 60% total in consumer, and then the rest is in sort of tech. And I feel like I see our tech founders and they're hustling, they're all together, they're grinding. And then you see the CPG founders, and there's a guy who's on the marketing side, but then they've got their celebrity, and then they've got, it's very fragmented, and it's not as cohesive as, as sometimes other sectors are.
What's the dream team for a CPG company if you start one today?
Great
Oh,
question.
Founders, a
Yeah.
tech, a celebrity, like what's the
Yeah.
distribution?
Like,
Yeah.
do the celebrities actually sustainably help the business?
Yeah.
Yeah, so most of them don't. But there's few examples of brands that have done really well, like Casamigos. You've got Chris Hemsworth's fitness brand, so some of them do very well. But I think the ideal team is a second time founder who's been in CPG, uh, not necessarily had a successful exit or not, that's not something we focus on, but someone who knows the lay of the land. And then the second thing we look for is how focused on distribution is the team. Are they caught up in the hype? Are they caught up in going, obviously the expos are important and there's certain things you've got to do, but we look for a lot of brands that have diversified distribution. So an example I'll give you is we invested in a frozen brand. The brand's been around for 10 years. No one really saw it as a venture investment, which created a bit of market inefficiency that we thought we could sort of, see. And basically the story of this brand is they had been doing sort of gelato competitions all across the world, right? So famous chefs would come and compete, they would win awards, and the chefs that won awards, they would get, their own restaurants, their own gelaterias all across Europe. In exchange for competing in the competition, the chefs would sign away their recipes. And so what ended up happening is the company harnessed, 10 years of the world's best gelato recipes, but still giving credit to the chefs. So it's not what you think. It's not like the company's like stealing the recipes from the chefs. And so the whole goal is let's launch sort of this next level frozen platform in the food distribution space. So gelato as a dessert is very popular. Any fine dining restaurant you go to, the dessert they're going to have, it's not going to be soft serve ice cream, it's going to be gelato. And then obviously also the retail market. And so, this company had been slowly building its like, you can consider like the B2B arm of his business, like selling into, distributors for wholesalers and stuff. And, quietly building a massive business. And we found out after COVID, the entire market was like, there's a huge white space there. So they could build a 40 to $50 million sort of gelato business in B2B restaurants and fine dining alone without even touching retail. And so what you see, what happens a lot is someone will come up with an idea and then they'll stand outside Erewhon or some store and they'll say, look at our velocities. We've got great velocities. And then they put this data in a deck, and then they go to VCs and they say, hey, like, you guys should invest in us because we've got great traction. But the issue is when you go retail, you have no guarantees, right? Everything's based on purchase order. So you could have one successful purchase order cycle at a certain retailer and then they don't renew. And now you're suddenly looking for a new channel to grow. So these are the kinds of nuances that make distribution so important. I think taste is fine. I think taste is so subjective that, we have brands in our portfolio that I don't like. We have brands that I absolutely love the taste of. So I don't think taste matters as much as distribution.
Let me ask you a quick follow up on that, actually, because you said so when consumer goods go to some retail distributions and some of those retail distributions dry up, then sales take a tank, right? One of the things that I haven't seen this as a trend, but I've seen a specific company. Here, let me just share my screen real quick. I've seen a specific company doing some really cool stuff. You guys are probably all familiar with this company. So I'm doing some really cool with consumer goods. So for those who are watching who may not be aware with this company, I think big capital T think they're based out of Austin, but I think well yeah I think they're out of Austin. But the gist of this company is basically they go to events, they give out free water, and the packaging where usually the branding would be is should basically just an ad. And when I first saw that, I was like, oh, this is actually really creative. It's basically the idea of implementing the very commonly well-known ad-based model that is very common across tech products to consumer products. And I wanted to ask you, Arian, if this is something you're seeing across other areas as well. This type of model in which you're not so dependent on the individual sales of the good itself, but mainly dependent on partnerships in which through moving a bunch of volume of this good or exposing the brand to a lot of people, you actually end up earning the revenue maybe through advertising or a different model.
Yeah, no. So I've seen this brand. It's super interesting business. I think you're right. They're based in Austin. They're Texas guys. To be honest, not really. I haven't seen a ton of it. And if I had to guess, it's probably because a lot of emerging CPG brands are building products that are sort of difficult to build, right? Water is relatively easy to manufacture, but if you're trying to, you know, if you're trying to create like a next level PB&J with better for you ingredients, you kind of need a custom manufacturing facility. And so I think that's what's interesting is I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity for frontier technology in manufacturing, in efficiency of work, personalization. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more of it, but they're definitely sort of the first I've seen in the space.
So I think it's a matter of cost, not necessarily that the model maybe just doesn't work. Like, I mean, maybe the cost of packaging a single bottle of water can be offset by an ad or whatever the agreement is for that ad. But maybe like, let's say you go to an event and there's freaking free tequila, and the tequila is earning the revenue based on sponsorships, not so much on the sale of the tequila itself. Do you think it's
Yeah,
just a cost matter, or do you think the model is flawed?
yeah. I think it's definitely part cost, but I also think advertising is, generally tied, I think, to the larger macro, right? So it's interesting because it would have to be a good channel, right? Whoever's advertising on there, they would have to actually see results. I assume with this company, for example, if you take any actionable item from the bottle of water, you can sort of click on the QR code and attribute, that this is where you saw the ad from. I think another potential issue is sort of, are you targeting the exact person you want to target? If you're only at festivals, what kind of ads are you running? So I think there's a lot that needs to be refined on that model. I don't know it inside out, but I think one is cost, and two, if they can figure out attribution for it, I could see how it could be sort of a profitable model. And then obviously tying that to the business itself. So wherever they're manufacturing, how many ads can they run at once? Who are they going to sort of partner with? I think that those are all, interesting questions I'd love to ask,
Yeah.
this company.
Yeah, I think for general brand campaigns, so brand awareness campaigns, this type of stuff can work. But think of how many variations of a digital ad you can run when you're running it digitally, right? So when you're talking to somebody at a sports game, the ad looks different to them. When you're talking to somebody at a supermarket, the ad looks different to them. But once you print this for 10,000 bottles, the ad looks the same to all 10,000 people. And you can't
What
really
if you could just
control.
But what if you could just like manufacture like a very thin filament of glass that it's so cheap to manufacture at scale, and then you can basically get the cookies of the person based on near proximity technology with their phone. You get all the cookies, and
Yes.
you basically display a custom ad on the bottle.
Yeah, that bottle would be too expensive to make the model work, right? But I think
Who
there's
knows?
just so much precision in digital advertising now that you really have to make a a very compelling case for like non-digital advertising. Otherwise, non-digital advertising is largely focused now on just brand building and positioning and things like that. You don't really consider it like performance ads anymore because there's no way attributed to customize it. There's no way to attribute the performance. So people still use it, but it's just difficult. Yeah.
Do you agree with that, Ariane? Because I've heard both sides. Is that just because you can't attribute directly, there's still like secondary survey response, and I think people are kind of like going back on their word to say like it's not all paid media. Or what are you seeing in the market right now for consumer marketing? How they think about actually advertising and attribution?
Yeah, I mean, from our CPG brands, having a diversified channel is so important. When they first start, it's kind of like, maybe we'll go D2C, maybe we'll go retail. They kind of figure it out. Um, Rarely do people go 110% on both because it's really hard. Um,
Yeah.
I think you have to stay lean and you have to be able to move your spend around. I was talking with a brand a few months ago, and they were dropping so much money on paid media, nothing was working, and then they moved to print one quarter, and they beat revenue, from the previous quarter. So I think there's a certain dynamicism, and like I think I think consumers in general are novelty seeking. So whatever creative way you can, find them and reach out to them, I think that's what's really interesting. Um, but yeah, I mean, from a spend point of view, I don't think emerging brands, are in a position to spend, even 50 cents on something that they don't know is going to bring back $2 back. And emerging, I mean, probably like anything less than, 20 million in revenue in CPG.
Yeah. There's
Yeah, and the challenge with that, Aryan, like a lot of the marketing firms are now taking this full funnel approach, is what they call it. Because if you only grow the business from paid ads, you never actually build a brand. And as soon as you start cutting back on the paid ads, like there's no sell through, right? There's no actual sales for the product. And so you have to kind of like manage between actually building a sustainable long-term brand, even though you won't get an immediate result for it, right? Like you're not going to put in 50 cents and get $2 back. But you have to have that full funnel marketing where there's a balance. And maybe when you're an emerging brand, you're largely focused on, performance marketing, right? Like where you're getting that result immediately and maybe less focused on the brand building. But as soon as you start getting into the big leagues, that's where the difference comes from having these, having these strategies that don't pay off immediately, but are necessary to make a sustainable brand over time.
Yep. Yep.
One of the somewhat crazy ideas I've heard in the last year is a company who is looking to get into waste management, a private waste management company. So that way, the idea was if you had certain households sign up for the program, they would get paid to have free waste management collection. And then this organization would take the trash, basically use computer vision to see what products the company bought. And they could use like a physical attribution method for people to actually like say, hey, the mailer that we sent, the person actually bought the product, or like, hey, this like physical thing. And it was kind of a wild idea to think people could actually do attribution for physical using this approach.
Nice.
So not sure if it'll ever find its way into
That's interesting.
kind of a wild,
No, but
Going through people's trash, right?
yeah.
you bring up a good
That's
point, though.
funny,
I
man.
think the hardest part when I first came across these businesses is, especially if a bulk of your business is in retail, you don't know who your customers are. You don't have first party data. You don't,
Yeah.
you get velocity data, but it's like flying a plane blind, and it's incredibly difficult. Your data is always behind, so it's been probably 6 weeks before you know what happened 6 weeks ago, and it's tough. It's that's why I think it's so important to find these alternative channels. Like I look at our portfolio, and the worst performing companies are the ones that kind of did what everyone else did. They said, "Oh, we just have such a great product. We're going to go to retail. We're going to do field marketing. We're going to pump cash into this, and get people to buy the product, and they're not doing too well. And the best performing ones are the ones that, hey, I'm only going to launch in this one account because it's super aligned with the demographic that's going to buy our product. And those brands are just, they're growing faster than some of our software companies. It's crazy. Yeah.
So, a question for everybody here is, where do you see some of these, more frontier technologies getting involved, like artificial intelligence? Obviously Brendan's the expert here on that. Blockchain, Sam is deep into the technology. Like, where do you see, Aryan, everybody, how that can improve the results for these consumer companies and improve the experience for the consumers as well?
I want to just jump on this real quick, and then I need to run. But I think there's two facets to that question. I think frontier technology embedded into consumer products, like that link of when a consumer product is made better because it has some sort of like technology that was previously not available. I generally think that's the way that society moves forward from a technological perspective. Like embedding frontier technology into consumer products is what gives us this, or what gave us this, or what gave us this, and the computer that we're using to talk, right? So I definitely think that tech-based consumer goods are really, 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 really interesting, and that's of course several advancements in chip manufacturing, robotics, software, and so on and so forth, right? But even beyond just traditional tech products, I do think, kind of going back to what we spoke about last episode, in which we talked about longevity and biotechnology and so on. I think we are a few years away from seeing an explosion in frontier technology being frontier biotechnology being packaged into a pill or packaged into a wearable, and then shipped to consumers as a direct to consumer product. So I definitely think that there's a lot of exciting things happening, especially with those technologies that can be manufactured and exposed to the people to people at scale. And then the second side of the equation is perhaps what Brendan is the best equipped here to discuss, which is better insights and better data analytics around the entire product life cycle and customer life cycle of several of these companies, right? So yeah, I think those are two really exciting avenues in which cutting edge technology is overlapping really interestingly with consumer products. That being said, I'll pass it on to Brandon, and I'm gonna run. But sorry for the shorter episode here. You guys are in good hands, and I'll be back for the next episode. Thank you, folks.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so Brendan, you're mute.
Thanks.
You're okay.
The two probably application areas that we're seeing like most clearly today is like one, the more traditional generative AI for generating designs for marketing, generating marketing copy. I think like one layer deeper is actually generating the product itself. So like today it's just like all the marketing copy. Tomorrow it's actually the product. So I think that's like the first wave that we're seeing and we're going to continue to see. And then the second is like analytics and like our ability to develop the next product. So using some function to, hey, these customers like this part of the product, how do we then generate the next version of the product, which like doubles down on that. I think the Apples of the world are like the best at this. It's just so technically hard to do that you just haven't seen a ton of other companies iterate based off of like real data coming off of real products. You have your Aura rings, your Whoops that I think are like falling into this category. Again, I love it. And I think that over time, we're just going to have less and less of like consolidation for super high tech companies to be able to do this. So that's like my take.
Interesting. What do you think, Aryan? Like, do you see the intersection anywhere? Like, give us an example from your portfolio where they've used it very effectively.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. There's a company we invested in about a year ago, and almost a year ago, and there's a very prominent, venture growth fund that normally invests later stage, and they came down market to sort of lead this deal. And what the company is solving is inventory for retail SMBs. It's a massive issue. The brands don't know how to stock and forecast everything correctly. And so it's kind of like it's imagine this hoodie, right? This hoodie in Dallas has a different stocking and a different sort of purchasing behavior than the same hoodie in New York, right? And so there's only so much you can do within your Excel compute. And there's only so much the guy that's running sort of manufacturing and running inventory management can do. But when you build sort of and leverage AI to optimize your inventory forecasting, you can really see a lot of improvements in efficiency. And so this business is working on that. And what's cool is they're kind of building their product with sort of the biggest retail mid-market SMBs there are. So think of your APLs, think of your a lot of your Shopify brands that also have stores now. And so that's probably been very interesting because they're still ironing out the product, but the level of demand that they saw from the brands that, they're like, hey, we're building this, would love it if we could iterate it with you guys, we'll give you guys dummy data, we'll figure it out. I mean, the interest was something like I've never seen before. And so we're not the only ones doing it. There's a lot of other businesses out there that have been focused on this issue. But I think specifically for retail SMBs, I think this company could, be very valuable.
Question on the current state of the world for how you think about like the creator economy on one side, all the way through like the conglomerate P&Gs, Johnson and Johnson. Where do you see that shaking out? I know 3 years ago it was a hot, cool thing for creator economy to be, tied into these brand creation mechanisms for CPG.
I think that was a nice wave a couple years ago. I think people that had access to really good celebrities and really good creators could leverage that and develop new brands, and then they would have the distribution when the world was in a better place to, capitalize on generating revenue. But I think it's shifted now to where people don't, at least as for myself, speaking for myself, it's like every ad is an influencer now, right? So everyone's kind of paid to post something. So I think we've lost, the genuineness of and slash the trust. And so I think there's this wave to sort of micro influencers, and Amiz and I have looked at some very interesting businesses and great founders in the space building, but I think there's definitely a wave away from creators. I think brands have realized that, again, attribution is just so hard, right? Like you have to do the things that build your brand, but at the same time, as an emerging brand, these influencers are expensive. I mean, you're talking 200K to $1 million for a post, for a post. And obviously that's the top tier ones, but still the middle tier ones are expensive. And if you've only raised a 500K pre-seed or a $2 million seed, that's a kind of considerable portion of your burn to spend. Not to mention you're going to spend. I mean, going back to what you said, though, I think what you brought up was a very interesting. I think having better tools to build products faster and kind of consolidate all the business views in one, I think is going to be huge. That's why I love what you're building is everything's kind of siloed, right? If you're a brand builder, you've got all your data on Shopify, you're building something there, you're spending something here, and you're spending 60% of your time actually with the product, right? So most of our CPG founders, they're in the factory. They're actually working physically with the product. And so what happens is they genuinely don't have the bandwidth to do everything else. And I think having automation, having extra tools, having sort of these co-pilots and agents that can help them, I think it would be, insanely beneficial, not only for the founders, but for capital providers as well. I think a lot of people that invest in CPG, they kind of struggle with investor updates, getting the right information from portfolio companies, because again, these teams just don't have the bandwidth. And so I think any tools that improve efficiency of work from product development to investor relations, I think could actually move the needle on more capital being deployed in the space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, what do you think about, ultra large influencers like Mr. Beast and all of his consumer brands, right? Like, I know that for a lot of the mid-tier or smaller influencers, there's just so much commercial activity on their platforms now that people have kind of lost the trust, right? And they don't really follow those things anymore. But Mr. Beast burgers and Mr. Beast like chocolates, like all that stuff, I don't know how real those numbers are, but the numbers he talks about here or there are like ridiculous
Yeah.
of how fast they're growing, like thousands of stores already for Mr. Beast Burger. Like they're all ghost kitchens, but still like thousands of locations.
Yeah.
And he's like changing the entire landscape. So I want to hear from you whether you think what do you think about that model, and whether you think that's real and sustainable, or whether even for the Mr. Beasts of the world, this is kind of like people will eat it once and it'll be cool because they can post about it, but it's not going to be a habit forming product.
Yeah, so we see a lot of, I mean, firstly on Mr. Beast, he's obviously him, Liquid Death. There's a few outliers out there,
Mm,
right? And he's obviously one, not only building successful consumer brands, but he's probably one of the most successful, you know, YouTubers in the last, in the last decade or so, right? And we see a lot of deals where it's insert creator and then insert some random brand that no one has disrupted in multiple years, right? My only issue and what scares me about these businesses is one, the way they're capitalized. So typically, when you
okay.
see these at the earliest stage, they have insane valuations. So one, you have to pay a premium. Two, they're most
Mhm.
of the time they're pre-revenue, right? Three, there's typically a studio or an incubator or some agency that's woven their way into the deal. So they're kind of the guys that own a good amount of the company, and then they bring in the creator, and then they have an operator that they've hired from some great company. And so I've personally said no to a lot of these deals. So far, I haven't been wrong on anything, but it's been too early to tell. So one, how they're capitalized. Two, what scares me is that I think there's a lot of longevity risk. I think, what if one day Mr. Beast just decides he just wants to live in quietness somewhere in Asia, right? Or what if the creator that's building the brand suddenly decides, oh, he has a family, so I can't market this alcohol brand anymore. So I think when you build everything on top of one person, I mean,
Key
it's kind of the
members.
first thing that it's massive risk. It's like a different kind of platform risk.
Mhm.
And so biggest risk I see is longevity risk there, which makes it hard to pull the trigger because now you need, you know, yeah, you're building a good brand, but you got to make sure you get out at the right time. And so, I mean, you guys know to build these consumer brands, you need significant growth capital. You need
Mhm.
buy-in from bigger funds
Mhm.
or other, growth stage investors. And so, as an early stage investor, if you invest in those kind of deals, you need them. I'll give you an example. So I saw a deal $4 million raise at a 20 million valuation, prominent creator in a category that hadn't been disrupted. Capital cap table was really interesting. The celebrity owned like a third of it, the agency owned a third of it, and then the new operator that had hired to be a CEO only owned 8%. And then the remaining was for the new investors that were coming into the round. And my math's like very general here. I can't remember the exact example, but you guys get the point. So basically,
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
them, their whole pitch is like, here's this creator, he's got the distribution. Overnight, we can get the distribution that past brands would have dreamed of, right? And so the issue is, I need them to execute perfectly, right? I need them to absolutely murder it. And then I also need buy in from growth stage investors because they can only grow as much inventory as they have. And they need to spend on a lot of things. And when you first launch, your product isn't perfect, right? So a third of it's going into R&D and product development. So it looks like a really amazing deal. It's like, oh, it's insert celebrity's name. Like, let me get in on this deal. What ends up happening is because it's not like a tier A celebrity, like we're not talking about, a Kardashian brand or Mr. Beast brand. We're talking about sort of the layer below, right? What ends up happening is I need them to execute perfectly. And then if the market conditions are bad, growth funds may just not want to take a chance on the business. And so what ends up happening is these growth funds will come in and they'll put liquidity preferences, they'll put all these different terms and ratchets that actually, hurt the earlier stage investors. So you're kind of not really getting paid for the risk you're taking that early on. Yeah, that was a bit long, but yeah.
It's almost like you guys struggle from not just the company itself, but because all the other companies in the category have like had this happen to them, that even if you are the black swan, no one thinks you are because you can't figure that out until 3 years later.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. And especially and this is one of the reasons that the valuations don't reach $1 billion is because, like what you just said, you can only grow as fast as your inventory can grow, right? And that at the core of it is the problem, is that if you want to sell $1 billion, well, you got to raise $1 billion or get financing for $1 billion because you need to have $1 billion of inventory somewhere. And that exactly is why the scalability of some of these companies is always in question. Like that influencer, I don't doubt it, can get you started off multi-million dollar, sale from the get-go. But in order to meet that sale, you're going to dilute yourself so incredibly over the years that even if you make it, the scalability of the product and the overall offering is just so limited. And you compare that to, a technology company, and it's much harder to be, and for an influencer to give you that distribution on the technology side, right? Especially if you're like B2B software, right? Like there's no influencers. But if you do grow at this incredible pace, all you have to do is keep up with your AWS build, right? And that's all you have to do. And as long as you can keeping up with that, you'll be okay. So I think that at the core of it is the cash flow problem is what I think Shark Tank actually has done a good job of like teaching that to people, because that's the last thing that people think about. They think about, hey, if I have sales, like everything else will figure itself out. And in these CPG physical brands, that's just not the case. And Shark Tank does a good job at teaching people what inventory management and your cash flow management there is. And I think there's actually a big space for companies to step in and actually help solve this cash flow issue. But you have to be not just like my dream team on a CPG brand is not just somebody who can sell the product and build the product. I need like a CFO in there who can manage the cash, because if you don't have that figured out, it doesn't matter how much you can sell or how great the product is.
Yeah, yeah.
No, go on.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was going to change the subject, so if you have a point, definitely finish.
No, you got it. You got it. You can change.
So one of the things I think a lot about is, we've offshored majority of manufacturing from like clothes to like technology. And I think part of that has like led to the US being a marketing and sales led company, and a lot of manufacturing happening abroad. So we think, secondary to what the actual company is, it's still a product company. We're building a physical good, but we've kind of pushed that to the side because it's harder to iterate because it's overseas. As we see some of like the globalization, subsiding, do you guys imagine there's a future where, we become much more homegrown US, Mexico, Canada manufacturing, and that changes the CPG environment? Or how do you guys think of like physically being closer or further from your product?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you want to.
Yeah, I have, I spent some time in the Philippines and Vietnam the last couple of months, and the deglobalization is happening in a lot of the countries that have that political, agenda and are actively trying to, fight that geopolitical struggle. But what that's doing is it's pushing a lot of that manufacturing into countries that have always been kind of neutral, right, and are happy to be neutral. And so a lot of the manufacturing out of China has been moving to Vietnam, Philippines, and some of these more neutral, jurisdictions, even though some of them have, some non-democratic kind of systems. They're generally like stable and neutral in their approach. And so they're much more like reliable when it comes to these things. They're just small players. They're not large players here anymore in geopolitics. And so I think that the deglobalization is happening maybe in some of the larger players, but it's actually being pushed into Africa, pushed into Far East Asia, pushed into other jurisdictions that are still quite neutral. And so I still think that there is quite a significant cost advantage to be had staying offshore for some of this manufacturing. And so I think maybe some of the lighter goods or some of the higher value goods will, or maybe some of the more strategic goods like chips and stuff like that, like light, high value, strategic, they might move onshore or near shore. But I think for pens or things that are not strategic, or I think they're going to stay offshore, and we'll continue to have this tension, which is unfortunate in multiple parts of the world. But there's some neutral jurisdictions that people can work with.
Do you feel the same
Yeah.
way, or have you seen like the print on demand, wave hit the Mexico region, or is this like just a blend?
Yeah, no, I agree with Hamis, but I have also seen a significant interest in onshore manufacturing, specifically anything related to personalization. So a lot of the deals that I've seen lately have been in fashion tech, anything that can help consumers buy products that are more personalized for themselves. And I think the most interesting company that I saw, there's a lot of software that's doing it through computer vision, a couple players in that space. But the most interesting business that I saw was, um, the founder, amazing founder. She was building personalized clothing for women, based on obviously your size and your fit, and every single piece of clothing was made to fit. And so she was manufacturing here. COVID happened. She pivoted her business from the clothing brand to building um, garments and clothing for hospitals and the military, and she won those deals because she was based in the US. And so what happened is she
Yeah.
inadvertently built like a 15 to 20 million dollar revenue, 4 million EBITDA business a year, and now she had enough cash flow to really kill what she actually wanted to do, which was the personalized garment for consumers. And so I think there's been a lot of interest there. Like, imagine if you go online and any t-shirt company or any company you want to purchase a product off of, the shirt or the product is exactly based on your fit and size. And I think that's definitely where we're headed. I don't know when we're gonna get there, but I think 3PL manufacturing, there's a lot of room for innovation there. Um, but I haven't seen a ton, probably because it's quite capital intensive, and maybe we're just not tapped into the right funnels there. But I think there's a lot of room for improvement there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the main, like the core of it is just the cost of labor, right? And technology doesn't really change that unless, especially the customization that you're talking about. Like if we can imagine like a totally automated process, then okay, now technology does change the cost of labor. But that's why in the first place everything went offshore, right? Is because
Yeah.
that cost of labor was the main factor. And the cost of labor actually in the US is going up. It's not changing. And so I think that more and more technology in the US, if it can really get to the point where it's you know significantly cheaper, or even even comparable to being offshore through technology, then of course, right? Like it's the best of both worlds. But if we're using American labor in our process and somebody else is using, Vietnamese labor, like there's no chance that we can make the numbers work.
Yeah.
Interesting. Not even if you thought about some just-in-time cash flow, like sufficed way to say, hey, we're manufacturing in North Carolina and serving North Carolina customers, and because of that, like we can figure out some like interesting way to put a 15-day, 30-day payment schedule together to actually not hold that inventory cost. I don't know. I remember for a while those last mile delivery and manufacturing sounded like they could be a play here, but I haven't heard much.
Interesting. Yeah, like if you could solve, maybe the solution here is, yeah, you can compete on the labor cost, but if you can solve the cost of carrying inventory, kind of like fast fashion or like made to order, but it can just be like done that fast that it feels like you got it off the shelf, then I think you could probably make sense of the numbers, right? Because you have zero inventory, and your competitors have a lot of it. So maybe that is what makes the difference, right? Like that's the silver bullet. But again, requires a lot of technology that can make the experience like buying it off the shelf, right? So if you can compress the timeline within a few days of like a custom order, then yeah, the experience feels the same, but the company doesn't have to pour millions into holding inventory.
Yeah.
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 I've one more like question that I've seen a lot of kickback right now. How are consumer companies solving products and companies CPG solving the returns issue? Like I've just seen a ton about are they throwing away products? Like how does this like actually shake out? And is it as bad as like the online community has made it to be?
Yeah, so in food and beverage, not as big, right? Because it's like hard to return a half-eaten PB&J, but in clothing, it's massive. I mean, there's some these brands, you know, return rates anywhere from 15 to 30 to 35%, and ultimately it takes back
That
to
high?
why
Wow.
it's that high, right? Yeah, it's incredibly high. I mean, I think the average is around 30, maybe mid 30s or something like that. And again, that's why kind of people are focusing on made to measure, because that's how people are trying to solve it. I think I've seen interesting businesses come across the desk solving for returns. But it seems like consensus there maybe that, look, returns are just expensive. No one's really been able to come up with an amazing solution yet. So what if we go back, instead of solving, the symptom, we solve the main disease and make better fit sort of products. So I know that's kind of been a
How
little
much
bit
of
of the
Yeah, I was saying, how much of the returns is just the size? You think it's actually 90 to 100%, or is part of it malicious, or part of it fraud, or part of it that's how they try on clothes, and because it's free returns, they don't actually have to, even if it fits, it still doesn't mean it solves the actual end
yeah.
problem. Like if you had a perfect fit,
Yeah.
how much of the returns do you think would still happen in these
Yeah,
issues?
so I'm close to a sort of a very successful, D2C brand, and based on their data, it's kind of mostly fit. I would say
Really?
out of the bucket of returns, it's probably like, you know, not mostly, like probably 40 to 45% is fit related. But I think there's so many brands that have used the free return sort of model, and I know so many people that will order clothes and like they have probably no intention to actually keep all of them. Like they're genuinely trying them on, and then they're just going to send it back, and ultimately it's a party that someone's going to have to pay for someday. And everyone's gotten used to Prime. You get everything literally in less than 4 hours. And I'm not too familiar with how that's working for their cash flow, but I've heard, it's not the best.
Right.
But I think it's a party that a lot of brands play, and someone's going to have to pay for it. And I haven't seen, amazing solutions yet for returns, but I know I have a lot of friends. They're like, oh, we'll just do a $200, $300 order, and then most of it goes back, and then may get one, And so what happens is like the AOV looks really good, the CACs are low, but then you really double click into the business and you're like, okay, this AOV was actually like, if you follow the life cycle, it's like only 10% of your consumers are actually spending significantly more than your CAC. And so now you've got this weird thing where it's a business, again, on the surface level looks really good, but then you look into the KPIs and it's like, okay, this is a little interesting. And I guess the reason I look at these things very hard is because I had the business that I was working on. We were a ed tech marketplace, so peer tutoring marketplace, and marketplaces kind of on average, a business like that it should be profitable on day one, right? And so all I was doing was connecting students that needed help to students that needed tutoring. The issue is my tutor base was younger tutors. That was our competitive advantage. Is if you're a 15-year-old kid, you don't want some 60-year-old from Harvard PhD tutoring you for algebra 2. You want someone closer to your age because you don't need to have a PhD in math to tutor algebra 2. The issue is they turn over a lot. So, it costs me nothing to acquire them, the family, and then they really like their one tutor. The one tutor leaves, and now I have to replace them. And now suddenly, every 6 to 8 months, I'm replacing my entire tutor base. And so, yeah, could you go and raise a round and pump into pay growth and probably scale it to a few million? You 100% could. I know a lot of companies that did that. There was one in the early 2010s they did that, and then Google had like some update to their algorithm and they lost the business had to shut down in like 3 months because their only channel was
Yeah.
Google Ads. And so that's why I get so like hung up on these things, because like it's really got to be a sustainable long-term solution.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, when we use all these consumer things, Brendan, you don't think about how hard it is to on the other side to actually build the business around it. You just take the most of it. And interesting. Yeah, tough business. Every business in the world is tough, man. Like,
Yeah.
doesn't matter what you do, they're all tough.
Yeah.
All have their own kinks. Yeah.
Our joke in I grew up doing electrical engineering as my undergrad, and it was like hardware is hard, software is not. So
Yeah.
I've never been in a full hardware business, but I assume it's probably similar to some of the physical good CPG brands and the difficulty of like having that entire supply chain.
You've had all kinds of clients, Brendan, right? You've had the consumer clients, non-consumer clients. Like, how does the data needs, and how do their AI, decision intelligence needs differ from non-consumer brands?
I think that the needs are exactly the same.
Okay.
I think the groups just have a different technical, experience, and they haven't had to have that experience because there's like more of an intuition, because they're not sitting there watching web logs for a technology company. Like no one's doing that. So a software company needs data to understand how people are using their product. But if a physical good company, you're physically, creating those first few products, sending them out, you're feeling like the actual intrinsic where you're sending it. Like imagine like a brand new CPG company that has to physically go, make and pack slips and whatnot, and actually send those out. So they physically are a bit closer to their customers. They're answering customer service tickets of like the product. So I think they have a better intuition for their business than a lot of the technology first companies that maybe just haven't had to, or they've outsourced parts of it. But I think that at the end of the day, like the actual data needs are the same. They just have less of a proficiency to already be in the data.
Okay.
So let me ask you guys a quick question. So in CPG, the acquirer universe is very vast. There's a lot of lower mid-market private equity firms that'll take a struggling brand because they already have sort of their manufacturing set up. There's some synergies. And so a lot of times when we're looking at companies, we ask ourselves, is there a fail-safe mechanism here where if they get to 15 to 20 million in revenue and they can't get a larger fundraising round, what are the sort of options for us, right? And this is why I sometimes think multi-stage funds are sort of perfectly positioned for CPG investing, just because you can take the company through, the entire sort of life cycle. For tech investing, since you guys may be closer to that world, what happens with a sort of small market sort of software company? Is the acquire universe vast? What are usually like outcomes there?
Acquihire.
Acquihire, yeah. IP, acquihire, there's a lot of value there. And sometimes you can become enough of a problem, even though you're losing money, but you become enough of a problem for a larger company that they'll just buy you and shut you down, right? Just to get you out of their market. So I would actually argue that because even consumer focused companies can buy technology, but technology companies would not buy a consumer brand, right?
Right.
So like, and so I think I would argue that probably the tech landscape for acquisitions, even for struggling companies, it's probably larger, because you need a very specific type of buyer to buy a consumer brand. But almost every business today is a tech business, right? Like even the PB&J company, you could argue is a tech business, because of how much tech they use. So if there was a large enough PB&J company, they could buy a inventory management company, right? To
Yep.
kind of include in their systems. And so I think probably the deal making happens quite a bit more often, but there are no hard assets to give liquidation value to tech companies. But at least there's inventory, machinery, molds, like all kinds of stuff that could have liquidation value in a CPG brand, and that's why I think it has a higher floor. Um, but tech companies, there's not really much there other than whether the intellectual property or the team you've assembled is like valuable to somebody else. So that happens, and there's a lot of platforms that are kind of being built to encourage this, to do these micro acquisitions and kind of piece things together. So I think we'll see more of that happening. There was a really fun tweet or LinkedIn message that I saw where a guy bought his son like a B2B, not B2B, a SaaS business, and for his birthday for $10,000, and they scaled it up. They used to work on it after like school, and they scaled it up to $50,000 in like ARR, and it's awesome, right? Like the kid's learning a ton, and I would have never thought that this business would a $10,000 business SaaS business would have a marketplace, but there's marketplaces, and so I have every intention of doing that, with my family instead of giving them, a college fund. Like I'd rather give them a SaaS business and go figure it out. But that's what really like opened my eyes to like, okay, so even $10,000 SaaS businesses can be bought and sold, and there's like real value there. Like you can actually scale the business.
Interesting. Okay, let me. Yeah.
Here's kind of a ridiculous contrarian take. Like, right 30 years ago, physical good companies were like providing a value, like actual value, right? It's a physical good that you're using your day to day. And then in the last 30 years, like the IT revolution, and like there was a lot of value made there. If like we'll wave a wand and say in 15 years, intelligence is solved, like software is just solved by like the best AIs in the world. They can do the marketing, they can do the supply chain intelligence, the forecasting, the everything. The physical good companies in supply chains and manufacturing process, that actually becomes extremely valuable again, because the ability for that to like go down to a marginal cost of zero is very hard unless we have material science advances, physical advances in the way we ship and pack products. Like those things, there's not going to be just an insanely better way to move, a bunch of goods from China to the US. But there is probably a really easy way in the next 10 years for the forecast from an AI model to get really good at actually predicting that. So I think,
Interesting.
right, today it is hot and cool to be tech only. But who knows, maybe we'll flip in 15 years and it'll be everyone's CPG is the hot product market to be in.
Interesting take. I like that. Brendan always has the contrarian takes, and they're spot on. Yeah.
No, that's super interesting. So let me ask you guys one more question. We see a lot of deal flow of late for consumer brand builders, right? So here's a co-pilot for marketing. Here's a co-pilot. Here's banking for consumer. Here's these sort of business fundamentals, and then they've packaged it up, and now they're targeting CPG brand builders, right? And I have no doubt the market is big enough. Like there's thousands of these brands. I mean, look how many exist on Shopify. And so One thing I was going to ask you guys is, when you see these kinds of businesses as a technology investor, how do you view platform risk, right? So if my entire potential book of business is on Shopify, you know, how do you guys view that? And I know Klaviyo just had their IPO. About 70% of their revenue is on Shopify. Shopify owns, I think, 10 to 11% of the company. Huge success story. But for these emerging brands that are pre-product market fit, how would you guys sort of look at that?
Yeah, the truth of the matter is there's platform risk no matter what part of technology you're at or what you're doing, right? When it comes to infrastructure, the platform risk is everybody's on AWS, Google, or Azure, right? There's platform risk.
Right.
If it comes to marketing technology, you're really focused on Facebook, Google, or something as this platform risk. If you're a if you're a blockchain company, you're either on Ethereum or Solana, there's platform risk. If you're an AI company that's a wrapper, you're using OpenAI models, there's platform risk, right? And so it's very difficult for you to build the whole stack from scratch in a way that you don't have platform risk. And not just from the building of the product, but the distribution of the product. At some level, you're going to have platform risk. And so I don't actually see businesses, even in the frontier tech space, where I can legitimately say, oh, this has no platform risk, and the company building for a software for Shopify has platform risk. So they all have platform risk at some level, in some way or fashion. And you just, as an investor, have to size your position appropriately to how much platform risk there is. And but I don't think you can really get away from having any platform risk.
I think I agree with all those points. The one thing I'll add is I think in the company building stage, you inherently have to take the risk because you can't put all your eggs in all the baskets.
Yeah.
You can't be on Magento, Shopify, Amazon. You have to, in the beginning, say, we are going to make a bet, and our bet is going to be Amazon, plus we're running some TikTok ads on the side, or hey, we're all on a Shopify and Meta, whatever that looks like. And even for our business, like we have to be kind of like bought into OpenAI or Anthropic.
Mm-hmm.
We can't be on every AI tools chain just to reduce that risk. To then maybe the series B and above, that's when you're looking to diversify that risk because you can take the longer term approach. But probably those first few years, you have to double down on something and commit.
Yeah, and that was kind of like the pitch for blockchains, right? Where, blockchains will come in and take, some of the platform risk away, but they introduce other types of platform risk. So, Solana and all the companies related to Solana took a beating because one of the biggest backers was FTX. And FTX went under and Solana was working perfectly fine, but everybody took a beating because of that. And there was significant platform risk. It works in a specific protocol. The language is specific. You can't just port it over to some other blockchain. So I agree with Brendan, right? Like the closer that you get to having the financing and the team in place to diversify that risk, like you should. But in the beginning, you don't want to spend your time and money worrying about Amazon, going under or changing their terms on you, right? Like there's just such a large group that it would affect that you're probably okay. But in the long run, if you don't worry about those things, then you don't build a very sustainable business.
Yeah. Amazing.
Good.
I think
Yeah, well, thank you.
Too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This was awesome discussion. Aryan, learned a ton from you. I appreciate you jumping on, and we'll definitely have you back soon.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. Good to see you guys.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.